Hey guys, so I'm back at looking at Donkey Kong. Yeah, I know. No Tomb Raider yet? Yeah, it's gonna be a bit. I decided to take a break. I was kind of feeling exhausted. We were having trouble with our PlayStation 5. It seems like it's back up and running, so I might start Tomb Raider back up soon. But I'm also working on Diddy Kong Racing, so there's that. And I know a lot of people like these ports and games. I have already talked about some of these ports and games, but I'm only doing the video to talk about them just a tad bit more. I covered some of these briefly during my, Donkey Kong marathon. The issue is, I missed the Donkey Kong Land games, as well as one educational game when I was doing that marathon. So I figure I could do a quick video briefly talking about Donkey Kong Land and why I don't play it, and touch on some of the games that I've already briefly talked about. Is that a stupid idea? Probably, but hey, I figured this would catch me up in time to work on Diddy Kong Racing video, and that's actually my current focus. Tomb Raider? I'll finish it, absolutely. But the game is so long, I did not know how long that was gonna be. I horridly underestimated from it. So yeah, taking a break, PlayStation problems, no big deal. I'll defeat the tombs for sure. Either way, while I'm working on Tomb Raider, I'm going to be also working on some unfinished business that I have. And Donkey Kong happens to be one of them. Now, I'm only really going over the Donkey Kong Land and Country games, not some of the spin-offs that are happening around like the Advanced era or anything like that. I will mention Donkey Kong, however, the portable one that kind of leads up to these games, and Donkey Kong Jr. Math because, yeah, I might as well talk about it somewhere. Oh, my ADHD causes issues like this sometimes, but I really do want to finish some of these a bit more, so let's do this. Let's take on the Donkey Kong Handhelds! Alright, so let's just get this out of the way. Donkey Kong Jr. Math. I'm just adding this on here for the heck of it, since Donkey Kong doesn't really have a lot of spin-offs, and most of them are racing games. Anyway, in 1983, Donkey Kong Jr. Math came out in the Japanese markets, and yes, this was released in Japan first. So, on the Famicom. The NES wasn't even around in 1983, at least not here in the United States. It came out in 1985, which, yeah, Donkey Kong Jr. Math followed suit in 1986, so there's that. Either way, this is Math. You play a Nintendo-endorsed ROM hack of Donkey Kong Jr. for the NES, but using it to learn math and solve math problems instead of, actually platforming. This is an okay way to learn math, I guess. I'm not against it, but it's so slow. You have to move Junior around a lot to solve the problems. There are better options, I'm sure, and with that, I'm moving on from this game. I covered it, so there you go. Alright, let's talk about the first actual portable game on this list, and let's discuss Donkey Kong fairly briefly. Released for the Game Boy in 1994, this game was the poster child for the SNES adapter for the Game Boy. Donkey Kong for the Game Boy is easily one of the best Game Boy games of all time, from what I've both read and even played. Frankly, this game is amazing. I did a full review on it, but to shorten it, this game is a massive puzzle platformer that is a sequel of the original Donkey Kong, disguised as a remake of said Donkey Kong. Some levels from Donkey Kong Jr. and all the levels from Donkey Kong are here, but this game is actually super long for a Game Boy game. Go check out my original review for more details, but I do heavily recommend this game. Go play it any way you can if you haven't already. Alright. Now to the, portable games that I haven't talked about. Everyone but me loves Donkey Kong Land. I can't stand this game. The camera is so jerky when you move. The game doesn't run smoothly, which is the biggest issue I have, but it isn't the only one. Things are super hard to freaking see in this game, which I do kind of understand. This game came out in 1995, a year after the previous Donkey Kong game, and they tried so hard to replicate the graphics from Donkey Kong Country, but I'm sorry, you cannot tell enemies, platforms you can stand on, even background elements apart. They all blend together. Don't get me wrong, very impressive, but dang, the graphics of this game, they just don't work. Having 3D models compressed to sprites on the Super Nintendo was really cool. It actually worked really well. Doing it on the Game Boy in 1995 is interesting. I just wish it worked better. There are some things here too. Flickering is rampant when you get a partner. They can't share the screen, so they just ascend to the heavens. Jumping is horrible as well. Donkey and Diddy both feel heavier than they really should be, making some jumps way trickier than they should be. Donkey Kong Land is the most original portable game for this entire series, but overall, it controls like hot garbage. I do not recommend. Well, just a year later in 1996, we got Donkey Kong Land 2, also for the Game Boy. This game is a bit better than Donkey Kong Land for sure. It moves smoother and works better in general as long as you don't swim. First major area, and I run into a swimming level that is next to impossible to beat without a ton of luck and a ton of memorization. What the hell? The screen crunch here is horrible. Regardless, on levels where you're going horizontal, things work out pretty well. The graphics were also toned down to make platforms easier to see. Still, moving vertically, there's a lot of blindsiding you're going to find, especially in the rope levels, which are already kind of more difficult to begin with, and water sections are just the worst. It is so easy to not see enemies, and swimming controls aren't exactly great here. The starfish that home in on you are incredibly dangerous due to all this. The other issue is, simply put, this may as well be a remake of Donkey Kong Country 2. There's much less originality here than in Donkey Kong Land for sure. Overall, this is much more playable, but still suffers from being on the Game Boy, which Donkey Kong Country 2 being on the Super Nintendo, and being roughly similar, I say just play Donkey Kong Country 2. At this point in time, it's way more accessible anyway. So, here's a bit of an interesting situation. Donkey Kong Land 3 came out on the Game Boy in 1997, but a spruced up Game Boy Color version came out in the year 2000. Well, it came out in Japan anyway. It's easily the better version with updated production quality, as you can easily tell where things actually are supposed to be. This is also the game that plays the best, at least from the Donkey Kong Land series. It feels better to control, and even going vertical, things are much easier to see than in Donkey Kong Land 2. It's still a shame that this is more of a remake, or rather a demake of the original Donkey Kong Country 3, similar to how Donkey Kong Land 2 kind of handled things. Donkey Kong Land 1 is still the most original game here, but none of these are even close to the console games. Still, Donkey Kong Land 3 isn't bad if you get the color version. Shame that the Game Boy Color version never came here to the USA or even outside of Japan. It's a great version. Honestly, I had a decent amount of fun playing it. Now, also in the year 2000, we did get Donkey Kong Country, not Land, on the Game Boy Color, both in and outside of Japan. Yay! Does this work better than... No, this sucks. This is a remake, or rather a port, of the original Donkey Kong Country, but on the Game Boy Color. Impressive technology that, they even got this running at all. Still, this game is horrid actually playing. There's no new additions, a few fixes to work on the handheld, and more bananas in the ground for some odd reason. That's probably because of how bad the screen crunch actually is. They want you to get more lives because this version is much harder with how bad the screen crunch issue actually is. Basically, there are already some do-or-die situations in the console games, but now you don't really see enemies until it's way too late to actually dodge. There's also the issue of tire jumps being incredibly difficult to time for some reason, and swimming sections suffering from controls. And guards shouldn't be this hard to manage. Wonky hitboxes don't help, and while the levels are ripped directly from the original game, they aren't one-to-one either, trying to help with the smaller screen resolution. There are some edits. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure this is all manageable if you really needed it. But in this day and age, avoid this version of the game. There is no need for this. The original version of Donkey Kong Country is already portable, both on the 3DS if you bought it already, and on the Switch. So there's really no need for this anymore. There is nothing interesting about this version outside of it being portable, and the original version now doing that, there's really no reason for this version anymore. Cannot recommend. Just 3 years later, on the Game Boy Advance, Donkey Kong Country was once again released for the portable console, and it's amazing how much better this actually is. 2003 would mark the year that Donkey Kong Country, the SNES version, had competition. See, this game just isn't a port or remake. This game actually fixed some of the boss fights. Oh crap, that alone makes this worth a try. The boss fights in the original SNES version were dull and not super complicated. This version of the game adds some more complexity, making the boss fights way better and far less dull than the original versions. This is amazing. The game also had some extra collectibles, and these are harmless. While they are hidden in all the original levels, they only unlock pictures on an album. While the controls aren't one-to-one, this plays well enough to compete, and the screen is much bigger, avoiding screen crunch well enough. The only real issue is the music. Well, the graphics are a little washed out, on an effort to make things more visible. And while the graphics aren't one-to-one, it does fix the, issue that the Land series roughly had. But the music just isn't as good here. The advanced music chip just isn't nearly as good as the SNES. It never was going to be that way. Still, I would say the music does do its best to live up to the liveliness and the energeticness of the original soundtrack. I wouldn't put this over the SNES version now, but there are aspects that are just flat out better here. The screen has been changed to help the screen crunch issue the last few games. However, the unintended, or possibly intended as a fix, consequence of this is that bonus barrels are much easier to see in the regular game. To make up for this, there's a new collectible in the form of cameras. I mentioned it earlier. They add, still images to this stupid scrapbook. These aren't just hidden out either. Sometimes you have to actually perform certain actions to get them. These are harmless though. They don't really add much, but they're not really causing much of an issue either. You can also get them by doing the new minigames as well. For cameras and lives, you can play minigames with Funky and Candy. Funky one is fishing, which, to be fair, the Game Boy Color Donkey Kong Country had this first, as a side game, along with a shooting gallery. This is more specific though, and the dancing game is just a simple rhythm game to play along with some pretty decent music. Overall, I recommend giving this one a try. As a remake, it's pretty decent, and while the graphics and music are better in the console version, this isn't bad at all. Easily a step up or two from the Game Boy Color version, and from the Donkey Kong Land series too, that's for sure. And the control is better than the Land games, so that's a plus. So let's talk about Donkey Kong Country 2, which only has the Super Nintendo version and the Game Boy Advance remake released in 2004, just a year after Donkey Kong Country 1. Probably using the same engine. I mean, if you want to count Donkey Kong Land 2, that's fine, but this is an actual, remake. The gameplay and graphics are roughly similar to Donkey Kong Country 1 remake. The music is serviceable, but lesser than Donkey Kong Country 2 original OST. The only real thing added are the minigames and a boss fight. See, the original game didn't have a boss fight for some specific area towards the end of the game. This game adds a boss fight there, which is just a large Kremlin with 2 swords. The swords are, the same ones for the second boss fight, but kind of doubled up. This is cool, but the art style of the boss somewhat clashes with the art style of the rest of the game. But I can get over that. For the most part, this is an incredibly competent port or remake, whatever you want to call it. The only issue is they added in a bunch of minigames again. Instead of getting cameras, the newest collectible is golden feathers. But you need to beat the minigames all the way through to get the brand new DK coins that are specifically added to this game. They gave the new minigames more significance by making the end goal much harder to achieve. This isn't the greatest choice. They turn the harmless minigames into things you need to do to get the best ending. I don't like this. Realistically, this is still kind of harmless. but they added significance by retraction rather than addition. Still, this isn't a bad version of DKC2. I just wish they did a bit more with the side collectibles, that's all I'm saying. And Rare being one to follow trends, a year later, 2005, and DKC3 hits the Game Boy Advance as well. This is a welcome version. For starters, there are new levels. There's a large area with a bunch of new levels and a new boss fight. The actual boss fight's not necessarily in the new area per se. You got swapped out with another area, and the boss fight's art style clashes again. I didn't play that new boss fight, but yeah, this is a bona fide level pack. The shopkeeper bears are all in this funky new art style as well for some reason, and I mean, they look more unique for sure, but dang, they look weird next to Dixie or Diddy. Bonus fact, Kiddy Kong was originally going to be named Dinky Kong to follow suit of all the player Kongs having DK as their initials. However, that name isn't necessarily an appropriate word everywhere, so Kiddy it is. That is his name in Japan, though, so it's kind of interesting. But yeah, DK works as a representation of Donkey, Diddy, Dixie, and Kiddy, but only in Japan. Interesting, but let's get back to DKC3. So, for those of you who don't know, David Wise is a composer for DKC 1 and 2. Well, he didn't actually do the music for 3, at least originally. That is why Donkey Kong Country 3 had a more atmospheric piece, or OST, than Donkey Kong Country 1 or 2. Music that worked for the levels, but not really music you'd listen to outside of that. It wasn't like a funky beat drop or anything like that. It was just music to add, context to the level. However, David was brought back to be the composer for the remakes on the Game Boy Advance. As such, he was there when DKC3 needed music for the advanced version. The tracks are good on their own, but sometimes they clash with how tense DKC3 is very often. It kind of removed some of the tension for some of these levels. Still good. The newest thing here are the levels, and to their credit, I liked them. Yeah, I finally tried them out this time around, and they were mostly fun. The underwater stages kind of sucked, though. Like, who put wind in a water stage? You were already not as precise with the Kongs in water, especially on the Advance, because again, controls aren't one-to-one. So this wasn't exactly fun. There's also a new sewer sledding level, too, and while I didn't mind these in the original, the new one really kind of sucked. The rest of the levels had interesting concepts. The boss fight, though, I didn't get to see the new boss. They swapped the new boss with one from later levels, so this new area has this shell clam looking guy. Either way, this game easily has the most added to it, but this game is also noticeable when it comes to the gameplay differences, swimming and vertical movement. There's a little less room to see and react to all of these games. Not as bad as Donkey Kong Land, but the screen crunch is technically still there. It just happens to be more noticeable here because Donkey Kong Country 3 has more vertical level design. Still good though, and a fun port of the original Donkey Kong Country 3, though the original is still better in my opinion, and it's more available too, so there's that. Overall, it seems like the handheld games are just a mixed bag. Sadly, I think the original Donkey Kong Land games aren't great. Maybe back in the day, but if so, they simply don't hold up well. Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color is technically impressive, but also not what I would call a recommended version of the original game to play. The advanced ports, though, they're really fun and add a lot to the original games, even fixing some issues with Donkey Kong Country 1. I do actually recommend trying these if you have access to them. As for Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, of course I still recommend this game, it's fantastic. And Donkey Kong Jr. Math, I don't, because it's an educational title and one that's not very fun. Overall, Donkey Kong did well in the handheld sale-wise. I don't think the Donkey Kong Land trilogy did bad on sales, so maybe I'm completely wrong about this. I will say that if you have to play any of the games here today, I still highly recommend Donkey Kong, and I also really recommend Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance. It was still pretty good. Next in line, I'd say Donkey Kong Country 3 on the Advance isn't half bad, and if you like the original, by all means give this one a shot. And recommend Donkey Kong Country 2 for, all this as well. But That's only if you really like Donkey Kong Country 2, but with more crap to do. And then afterwards, I'd say try out Donkey Kong Land 3, particularly on the Game Boy Color, as it's the better option for Donkey Kong Land series. I can't recommend Donkey Kong Land 1 and 2, the gameplay isn't great, and even if the first Donkey Kong Land is more original, I'm sorry, I can't recommend it. But I still recommend it over Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color. I cannot recommend that at all. There's nothing I can recommend there. Or Donkey Kong Junior Math. Sorry, can't recommend that one. Not at all. I really do hope this was a fun video for you guys. Honestly, it was kind of fun to make. The next time I visit our friendly apes will actually be Diddy Kong Racing, which I'll actually be covering 3 games with that particular one, but I'll mostly be focused on the N64 Classic. I know Donkey Kong is a Wii racing game too, but I'll cover that in a different video, so to speak, much later down the line. Either way, like, subscribe, and commenting really do help my channel out. Just saying, getting subscribers and getting likes on my videos does actually put it back into the algorithm, so that does really help me. Until next time, my minions, take care.